So dear Sangha, it's such a blessing to be able to be sitting here together with everybody. I have to confess that I'm what is known in technical terms in Buddhism as a sutra nerd. I really love going back to the original sources of the Buddha's teachings. And when I was thinking about what I wanted to share today, I was thinking about a very beautiful text in the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length discourses. It's for those of you who are also sutra nerds, you can look it up. It's number 32. And in that sutra, the senior disciples are having a Dharma discussion, and they're asking each other to share what practitioner illuminates the forest. What kind of practitioner illuminates the forest that they're staying in? The text is called at Gosinga. So Gosinga was a beautiful forest. And what I find interesting about this text is that all of the senior disciples share what they believe is the practitioner that will bring light to the forest. Ananda, who is the disciple who is known for having what we would call a photographic memory, an eidetic memory, who remembered all of the Buddha's teachings, said the practitioner that illuminates the forest is a practitioner who hears a teaching and remembers it. And all the other monks say, that's good. And then Revata, another disciple, says, for me, as I'm a hermit, and I like to practice meditation alone in the forest, the practitioner who illuminates the forest is someone who is always in retreat, always practicing deep meditation. And so on and so forth through all of the disciples. Each one of the disciples, as we heard this morning when we were touching the earth, had a particular kind of emphasis to their practice. The recorder of the teachings, the leader of the Sangha, the foremost in wisdom, and so on. And so each one of those practitioners was sharing that the ideal practitioner was somebody who did the same thing as them. Secretly, that's what we think too. The ideal practitioner is someone who does everything the way we think they should. And so after this discussion, one of the disciples says, you know what? All of these opinions are great, but why don't we go and ask the Buddha? So the other practitioners, the other monks said, that's a good idea. And so they all went and they knocked on the door of the Buddha's hut and they asked the Buddha, so we've all been sharing these things and each of us believes this, like somebody who remembers the teachings, somebody who's a meditator, somebody who's practices very simply and so on. Each of those people are the best practitioners. which one's the best, Buddha? And the Buddha said, yes, all of those kinds of practitioners are great. But for me, somebody who is simply dedicated to allowing the path to unfold in the way that it unfolds for them is the practitioner that illuminates the forest. So, for me, that's an invitation into recognizing that we're invited by the Buddha to bring all of ourselves to our practice. We don't need to become someone or something else. Let us look at our own tendencies and bring those to our practice. Allow those to shine forth. We don't need to become someone or something else. In fact, we're invited through the practice of mindfulness to become more fully ourselves, below the layers of that which we call I, me, and my, the things we identify with. One of the greatest teachings I received in my spiritual life was from Theyak Tan. Has anybody here met Theyak Tan? He was here many years ago. He taught us novices the fine manners, which, if those of you who knew Theyak Tan might find that a little surprising, since he was a real Zen master. And he shared something that I have inscribed on my heart all of these years. He said, dear young novices, I want to share something with you as an elder brother. Whatever you do, as a practitioner of mindfulness, don't cover things over with a whole lot of bells and incense. Just be absolutely authentic to where we are at this moment in our journey. We get asked a lot of questions, or I do anyway, and I often get asked, how did you get interested in Buddhism? And I think that's a good question, and there are 1,000 ways to respond. But one way that I like to respond is that when I was a child, I was a naughty child. And so I kept getting told, you need to wake up to yourself. And so it's really perfect for me, Buddhism, because Buddhism means the way of waking up. So I felt like, in a way, that seed was watered when I was young. You need to wake up? Okay, I will practice Buddhism, which is the way of waking up. And so I'd like to ask everybody here a question that I think is really important. Because when we say something like Buddhism is about waking up, that's what we call the universal. That's a concept. My question to you is, what do you need to wake up to? I think that's a question that we need to be asking ourselves every single day. What are the things that I need to be looking at? What are the places the areas that I'm blind? What are the things that I don't want to look at? In this way, our practice, our path can be transformative, can be unique, can bring forth the wisdom that's within each one of us, rather than a path of avoidance, of just getting comfortable. Tay said to me many years ago when we were drinking tea, Brother Fapai, if we're aware, there's nothing that's not the Dharma. There's nothing that's not a teaching. So I love to keep my antenna out wherever I am. And not so long ago, actually it was 4 years ago, the last time I visited Plum Village, I was asked to travel to Ireland to help to facilitate some retreats with some brothers and sisters. And when I got to the airport, the immigration officer asked me, is this your first visit to Ireland? And I said, yes, it is. What do you think I should see? And he said, oh, Dublin and Ireland are filled with pockets of goodness. And I thought to myself, that is a deep teaching. Many of us come to mindfulness practice because we're suffering deeply. We want to transform our situation. And we can lose sight of this essential teaching of the Buddha, that there is suffering, yes, but there are also these pockets of goodness, this innate goodness that we all have. The technical term for this is Buddha nature. That there is the suffering, but there is also this place within ourselves that's unobstructed, that's open, that's free. And meditation practice and mindfulness is about uncovering, revealing what is already there. It's not something that falls from the sky, but something that's deep within our heart already. One of the most ancient practices in the sutras that we have forgotten in our modern age, it's often listed in the context of the three recollections, recollection on the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Often the Buddha would add a fourth one, which is recollection of our own virtue, recollection of our innate goodness. And so I truly believe this is medicine for our time. It's something that we're quite averse to. We tend to look at what's wrong, what we need to fix, at our suffering only, without also looking at what is wonderful, what's free, what's open, what's compassionate. When the Buddha had his awakening experience, this moment in which everything was uncovered for him, there's a legend, and I like it a lot, because it's very deep. The legend goes that the Buddha said, "How strange. Every single living being has this capacity. Every single living being has this place in themselves that's free, that's unobstructed, that's open, that's wise. And our practice is to uncover this place." This is a radical shift of perspective for us from what's broken and wrong and what needs to be fixed to uncovering what is already there. Why don't we enjoy a sound of the bell? There's a subtle tendency of our mind, and that's the tendency to always want to be comfortable, to not be challenged in any way. It's the beginning point of the path, generating this sense of ease. And yet it would be a pity if we just stopped there, because that's the foundation for us, to be able to broaden our perspective, to be able to look deeply, to be able to transform. In the traditional terms, we don't call monastics monastics. In the traditional languages, we call them left home people. People who have left home. And so on the superficial level, of course, we've left our physical homes. But on a deeper level, we're invited to recognize the places that we hide. That room that we shut all the doors and windows and we don't want life with a capital L to touch us. And so I truly feel that each one of us as practitioners are invited to find our true home, which is different from this home of avoidance, this home of just getting comfortable. Tay said to me in the year 2000, Brother Fapai, please stop running around looking for small comforts, somebody to understand you, to get this, to get that, or needing something else, and look for the real comfort. Touch the real comfort. And so as meditation practitioners, we can have this tendency of avoidance. Mindfulness, applied correctly, naturally gives rise to an energy called Dhamma Vichaya. It means investigation. Brother Hui Truk, who's here, often uses the word which I find is very beautiful translation of this. He says curiosity. We become curious about things. So in a sense, mindfulness is not a passivity, but rather an active process of engaging with life within us and around us just as it is. Not trying to change anything, but showing up for our life. In this way, engaging this sense of curiosity, our steps, our breath, the contact of our body and the cushion, all of these things that seem absolutely ordinary, become extraordinary, become amazing. Sister Langim was sharing the other day about walking, and what a miracle that simple thing is to take a step. What a miracle it is to be able to sit at this moment without pain in our body. I tell you, as someone who every day experiences physical challenges, that's a miracle. We don't need to look far. There's a calligraphy that I love so much. It says, "The joy of meditation is our daily food." Our meditation practice, our mindfulness practice can be a delight in and of itself. It can be a form of nourishment. So let me ask you, how's your meditation practice? Do you enjoy your practice? And if so, what do you enjoy? I was so happy. A week ago, I arrived in Plum Village after a long absence, and I had a chance to visit Tay's hut and sit on Tay's deck. Many years ago, as a young novice, I was sitting with Tay, and Tay was laying in his hammock, which his hammock is still there. And as he was sitting in his hammock, I was sitting very properly, very stiff. And at one point, Tay looked over at me and said, "Brother Fapai, if you're going to sit here, make sure you swing your legs." That for me was a real moment of transition from a master to a student. Whatever we're doing, sitting, walking, standing in line, in the food line, that's a big thing for some of us. You know, she's taking way too much. Is there going to be enough for me when I get there? Why does this person have 27 kids? Where did they come from? Can we swing our legs? Can we enjoy this moment? How do we need to walk, to eat, to sit, to breathe, to do the absolutely ordinary? That it's a deep moment of enjoyment. We call this in Buddhism the bliss body. Sometimes we forget that, the enjoyment body. Do you enjoy your practice? Please, if there's one thing that you take away from this week in Plum Village, it's that enjoyment. Walking in such a way, breathing in such a way, sitting in such a way that that which we think we need is available for us right now. Our meditation practice and life itself is a form of nourishment. There's a modern catchword, which is mindfulness. It's incredibly exciting to see how accessible and widespread mindfulness has become. Mindfulness is an English translation of the Pali word sati or the Sanskrit word smrti. In fact, mindfulness as a translation in English was first used in 1870 by an Anglican pastor. So we have to understand that things are coming through a filter. That the word mindfulness is simply a translation of a practice, of an embodiment that may be quite different from our concept. For example, in the West, we've grown up with the Cartesian split between mind and body. We view these things as somehow separate. But in Buddhist meditative practice, this is not the case. I really like the French translation of sati much better, full awareness. Or In English, we can also say recollection, bringing back all the different parts of ourselves to be unified. And so I want to say something that I think is important. It may not be, but I think it is. The Buddha didn't just teach mindfulness. The Buddha taught right mindfulness, samasati. Right mindfulness in terms of bringing our attention to that which is in alignment with our aspiration, to that which nurtures the kind of qualities we want to see in ourselves and in the world. This is called the practice of appropriate attention. Yoniso manasikara, appropriate attention. I know people in my own family, I hope you're not watching this family. I know people in my own family who have brought a lot of mindfulness, not necessarily right mindfulness, to their anger, to their resentment, to their grudges. There's sides of my family that haven't spoken to each other for 20 years. I also know people who have nurtured qualities such as compassion, joy, love, connection. So as we generate this sense of awareness and investigation, of curiosity, we begin to notice what is in alignment with that which we most want to see in ourselves and in the world around us. And rather than being a victim, rather than being in a passive place, we begin to recognize the real heart of the Buddha's teaching, which is we have the capacity to choose. We have the capacity to choose where to put our attention. And that's one of the most powerful things that we can do. As we cultivate this attention, we become aware of the importance of mindful consumption, which Sister Dao Yim shared about the other day in our daily life. So how do you nourish yourself? Usually when we think of nourishment, we think of edible foods. Although nowadays there are a number of things that we put in our mouth that it could be argued that it's not necessarily food. It's never really existed in any natural form. In Buddhism, the teaching of nutriment, and in particular the 4 nutriments, is one of the most practical and transformative teachings. When we speak about mindfulness, mindfulness is always mindfulness of something. The 4 nutriments is a concrete way for us to be able to consider our situation and the situation of the world around us. In the Kudakapata, in an ancient text called the Questions to a Novice, which is a series of 10 questions that the Buddha asked a young orphan who became a monk. I love this text so much. The first question is, what is the one thing that connects everything? And the answer is, everything exists on food. Every single thing, our happiness, our sadness, our joy, our awakening, is nourished. The longer I practice meditation, the more I feel that this teaching on the 4 nutriments is one of the most important teachings of the Buddha. And it's an invitation for us to look at our whole person rather than just one aspect. In 2016, I was asked to offer a series of 4 teachings for Tricycle Online. And I thought, what should I teach on? What's really necessary? And I decided to offer a series of teachings on the 4 nutriments. And despite this being a core teaching of the Buddha, it was new material for most of the audience. People had not heard it, even people who had studied and practiced Buddhism for a long time. And that surprised me, because in Plum Village, our teacher has offered us this teaching again and again. He stressed the importance of this teaching. I'm getting older, like all of us. It's one of the 5 awarenesses. Getting older happens. And each of the 84,000 teachings of the Buddha are like a set of lenses for us to look at our situation. So not so long ago, I went to the optometrist. I was realizing that I couldn't see things very clearly anymore. My arms were getting too short to hold out the sheets of paper to be able to read them. Are there any other people in that situation? Yeah, okay. I'm not the only one. Thank you. And so when the optometrist created the new prescription for me and put on the lenses, I went, wow, is this the way that the world really looks? And I realized that the teaching on the four nutriments is one such set of lenses. A different way for me to be able to consider my situation, to be able to examine the functioning of a concept such as the Four Noble Truths in my daily life, to be able to examine how I've nurtured happiness, compassion, joy, and how I've nurtured suffering, both in the universal way of suffering in general and also the particular way that suffering manifests in me. Working with the nutriments in each moment can help empower us to interact more meaningfully with the stimuli we encounter in our daily lives and understand the triggers. In the Samyutta Nikaya, which is a collection of teachings of the Buddha, there's a very powerful sutra called the Puttamansa Sutra, the Discourse on the Sun's Flesh. It's in our chanting book for those of you who would like to read it. In that text, the Buddha goes through four kinds of nutriments, from the most tangible to the increasingly subtle. Both starting from edible foods, we move towards sense impressions, then we move towards volition, and then into consciousness. When I first read the sutra, when I first heard the sutra, I would be honest with you, I was shocked. There are some really strong images in that text. Now, I practice what Brother Hui Truk has so compassionately taught us, and when I have a strong reaction to something, I always try to engage a sense of curiosity. Why am I having this strong reaction? And why on earth did the Buddha give such strong imagery in this sutra, such repellent imagery? And when I looked with that sense of curiosity, I felt that one answer could be that the Buddha wanted to shock us into understanding the importance of nutriment, understanding the importance of applying this teaching, understanding the connection between what we consume both on the individual level through these four aspects of our being and what we consume collectively. If we want to transform our situation, then awareness of the four nutriments is a concrete way to do it. We can choose to consume items that bring peace and joy and well-being to our body and mind. Honestly, I love to teach this material in the context of a multi-day retreat. We spend one day on each of the nutriments, doing activities and practices and reflections around each of them. So today I thought just to present a few points in the hope that you will continue your exploration at home. The other day, Sister Dao Ngim presented the first two nutriments. And if we are a sharp practitioner, we'll notice that as we move through the nutriments from edible foods to sense impressions to volition and consciousness, we're moving from a macro attention, a broad attention, to a very fine and refined kind of attention, a micro attention, from the macro to the micro. The first of the four nutriments is edible foods, Kabalinkahara. It means the foods that we eat, as Sister Dao Ngim shared so beautifully the other day. But on a broader level, it also means all the material things which make up our existence, our environment, our possessions, so on and so forth. So all of the material things that we have and that we experience, that we interact with, this is the broader sense of nutriment. The second of the four nutriments are sense impressions, phasahara. In Pali, it literally means the food of contact. contact between our senses, our eyes, our ears, our nose, our tongue, our body, and our mind. Contact between those bases and a stimulus. That's a sense impression. Now the third nutriment, which I'm going to speak of a little today, is referred to with a very technical term, volition. That's pretty academic, that term. And it's even more academic in the Pali, so we'll avoid that for now. I like to describe it as that energy which moves us forward in any moment. And in fact, all of us in this room and outside are very sharp practitioners. So I want to offer you a pointing out instruction here. This third nutriment is the most important. Because if we know what we most want to manifest in our life, individually and in the life of our community and society, then all the other choices spring out of that. So we cannot overemphasize the importance of coming into contact with that deep longing of our heart for what we want. An intention is quite different from a goal. An intention is something that we're manifesting right here and right now. Not something that we need to get 10 years in the future, but something we can touch right now. Is it an intention to connect with others? A compassionate intention? An intention of love? Or is it an intention of closing down, of aversion in some way, of getting something for me? I shared earlier that we often receive a lot of questions. And one of the questions we receive the most, in fact, I even received it yesterday from one of the friends in my Dharma sharing group. They said, "Why did you become a monastic?" Oh, if only I had one ice cream for every time I was asked that question. Then I would have a whole other set of issues. So I'd like to ask you a question. Why are you a meditation practitioner? What brought you to meditation? What was the first spark of teaching or inspiration that brought you to this moment in time? What was it for you that awakened that deep longing, that search? And now, I know that some of us here this week are here in Plum Village for the first time, and some are here for the 20th time. So this is a special question for those of us who are here for the 20th time. If you have been a practitioner for a long time, why are you still a practitioner? Why are you still a practitioner? Volition, this nutriment of that which moves us forward, gives shape to our practice, and it creates the ground from which insight will bloom. The nature of volition, of that energy that moves us forward, will determine the nature of the insight that we have. We've got to be very careful what we wish for. A few years ago, I had the chance to be in the Root Temple on Thay's return to Vietnam. And at that point, we'd been in Vietnam for quite a while. I love Vietnamese food so much. In fact, it's after spending more than half of my life in the Sangha, it's what I would tend to go towards. But I'll be very honest. At that moment, I'd had a lot of Vietnamese food, and as we were on alms round, about halfway through the alms round, a gentleman offered me a baguette and some piece of cheese. So our begging bowl is called the vessel of appropriate measure, and we can only receive offerings up to the rim of the bowl. So as we continued walking around, people continued to offer, and when the offerings come to the rim of the bowl, we have a tradition in which we return something back. So I noticed that people were offering me sticky rice, and I would dig around, and I would offer back tofu. Or somebody would offer me some other kind of stir-fried vegetable, and I would offer back the bot lọc, I would offer it back, the Vietnamese cake. I was digging around underneath the baguette and the cheese to try to. We all have our strategies. And then I thought to myself, Phab Hai, what are you doing? What are you doing? This is not the correct practice. And so I, with a very heavy heart, a little bit like the monk in the story, a very heavy heart, the next time somebody offered me something in my bowl, I reached for the baguette and handed it back. Talk about letting go. And so we continued on to the Nam Yao, the park, where we sat down and had the meal. Now, I'll be really honest with you, because I spoke about being authentic before. We were sitting down having our meal, and I was practicing to be joyful for the person that received the baguette, but I was also looking to see who was it. We ate in silence, and then eventually we stood up and we began making our way back to the root temple. So we as monastics or as practitioners, we're used to having interesting encounters. And so out of the corner of my eye, we had our straw hats on so we can only see just kind of the ground around and some legs. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw these legs coming towards me with a pink bag in their hand. I thought, oh, what is this? Goodness. And this man came towards me and he thrust a pink plastic bag in my hand. So we're in silence and we're walking, so I simply bowed and I took it and I got back to the root temple, and inside was 6 baguettes and a whole packet of cheese. So hopefully your aspiration is not to just have a baguette and a piece of cheese. What is it that you most want? We have our superficial likes and dislikes and wants and things, but what is it you most want to manifest? And where do you think you're going to find it or become it? Recently, my aspiration has become much more simple. Aspiration is something that grows and develops and changes over time. Our teacher Tay said to us, if we're doing the same thing in 20 years that we're doing now, we failed. That's because we're always growing and maturing and changing as practitioners. And that's exciting and scary. Lately, my aspiration has become very simple. And that's because I deal with a lot of health issues. There are days that I cannot walk. There was 4 months I couldn't eat solid food. All of these things have led me to a very simple aspiration, and that aspiration is to say yes. Not only with my mouth, but with my being. For me, an attitude of not pushing away, not pulling towards, but just saying yes. So it doesn't need to be too lofty. It can be something very simple. In the we're always invited by our teacher to understand that which we're looking for, we need to be able to touch right here and now, to walk in such a way, to eat in such a way, to breathe in such a way that it is available for us right here and right now. This morning we had the transmission of the 5 mindfulness trainings, and I listened very attentively, especially to the sutra opening verse. I find that every time I listen to a text or a chant, I discover something new. And in that verse, there's something very interesting. It says, the Dharma is deep and lovely. We now have a chance to see it, to hear it, to study it, and what? To practice it. Okay. What does it mean to see the Dharma? I think we're pretty good in our day and age in terms of hearing the Dharma, in terms of studying the Dharma. But what does it mean to you to see the Dharma in each and every moment? And the thing I think we have the most challenge with is putting something, anything, into practice. We mistake the accumulation of information for wisdom, for insight. And some of us can approach our meditation practice with this attitude of accumulating teachings. If I could only study this or learn that or read something else, then I'll finally have all the tools that I need in order to transform my situation. There's a saying in the United States, I apologize to the translators and I wish you luck in translating this. It's called stuffication. Being suffocated by stuff. Having too many things. Having this mind that we lack something and our accumulations are going to fill it. We don't need one more thing. We already have more than enough. One teaching can be enough to transform our whole life. In fact, practitioners of old, they would often have only one encounter. Some of us think, oh, I wish I was living in the time of the Buddha, I would get so many teachings. If you're a student of the texts, you will see that even the senior disciples did not hear all the teachings of the Buddha. There was actually a controversy in the first council from some monks who said, well, I only believe what I personally heard the Buddha say. And other people saying, well, there was actually more teachings than that. There was this big controversy. So sometimes they only had one encounter, so they would travel for days or weeks, and they would meet a teacher and say, please teach me the essence of Buddhism. And the teacher, for example, Master Jiu Jiao, Master Zhou Zhou, they would say something like, go and look at the pine tree out the front. And so, of course, people will create a pilgrimage, and they even do to this day, they go and travel to this temple and look at the pine tree out the front and think that's going to teach them, everything, that's a mystical tree. But in that one teaching, we can see the invitation to come back into our life, to come back into what is present for us. If we're aware and we have enough conditions, one practice can be enough to transform our whole life. Lately, I'm engaged in giving a series of teachings on a sutra that's often overlooked, and yet our teacher loved. He wrote in his little booklet about this sutra, please treasure this sutra. Please give it to friends. Please study it and put it into practice. This is the discourse on the 8 realizations of great beings. And in that sutra it says, our mind is always searching outside of itself and never feels fulfilled. That this is the nature of our mind, that we will always think we need one more thing in order to be happy. For those of us who are here this week, I want to congratulate you because you're doing something very countercultural. You're doing something that is very challenging for a lot of people, and that is coming back home, coming back to yourself. And I want to read some excerpts from a study that I found quite interesting and might apply to our situation. The title of the study is Doing Anything is Better Than Doing Nothing for Most People, study says. Okay, getting older happens. Let me... Most people are not just comfortable in their own heads, according to a new psychological investigation by the University of Virginia. The investigation found that most would rather be doing anything, possibly even hurting themselves, than doing nothing or sitting alone with their thoughts. In a series of 11 studies, University of Virginia psychologists, as well as colleagues at Harvard University, found that study participants from a wide range of ages 18 to 77, generally did not enjoy spending even brief periods of time alone in a room with nothing to do. The participants, by and large, enjoyed much more doing external activities, such as listening to music or using a smartphone. Some even preferred to give themselves electric shocks than to sit quietly. I hope nobody felt like this during the sitting meditation. Participants were asked to sit alone in a quiet room and a laboratory with no cell phone, reading materials or writing implements, and asked to spend between 6 to 15 minutes, depending on the study, sitting quietly. Most reported they found it quite difficult to concentrate and their minds wandered, although nothing was competing for their attention. I'm just trying to break it a little shorter here. After this realization, the researchers took their studies even further. Because most people prefer having something to do rather than just thinking, they then asked, would they rather do an unpleasant activity rather than no activity at all? The results show that many would. The participants were given the same circumstances with the added option of also administering an electric shock to themselves by pressing a button. It is worth noting that all of these participants had received a sample of the shock and reported that they would pay to avoid being shocked again. Now here's where we need some compassion, everyone. 12 of 18 men in the study gave themselves at least one electric shock during the study's 15-minute quiet period. By comparison, only 6 of 24 females shocked themselves. What is striking, the investigators write, is that simply being alone with their own thoughts for 15 minutes was so aversive that it drove many participants to self-administer an electric shock that earlier they said they would pay to avoid. Our mind is designed to engage with what we consider to be the outer world. Even when we are by ourselves, our focus is usually the outside world. We've been conditioned to be consumers, always thinking that we lack something, anything. And so I keep encouraging my friends to discern if there are times that we bring this attitude of lack to our spiritual practice. If we practice from an attitude of lack, of thinking that we need something, we need to fix something, then our practice can become another project. Something to do in order to get something that we think is outside of ourselves. Now, I'm not going to say that we're not a little fixer-upper project. We certainly have things to transform. But this attitude of lack is very deep. This attitude of not being good enough is very deep. And there's actually a tendency of our mind that served our ancestors well, that can explain this tendency that we have. Are there any mathematicians in the hall? Oh, I'm so relieved. This will be right up your alley. Okay, what do you notice? Anyone?
What's wrong?
Okay. So thank you. I asked you what you noticed. I didn't ask you to tell me what's wrong. So that is correct. This is one narrative that we can tell. For example, 9 times 2 in this historical dimension is not 16. As a child, I used to wish it was sometimes when I was doing this, but in the historical dimension, 2 9s are 18. So that's correct. It's correct that there's one thing that is wrong. However, there are 3 other things on the board that are correct. This is a basic psychological principle called the Zeigarnik effect. Psychology 101, for those of us who have studied psychology. We have a tendency that served our ancestors well to focus on what's incomplete or what's wrong in any situation. It actually takes effort to focus on what's not wrong. So to put this into a very simple practice that I'd like to invite you to take home, when you notice this tendency in yourself to practice yes and. What else is there? Yes and. Again, the micro and the macro. What's not wrong in this situation? So as we've said before, the approach of Buddhist practice is to uncover the innate wholeness that's already been there. So I'd like to invite you to do a reflection with me. What is it you most want? Hopefully, again, it's not a baguette. And what do you mean by that? Let's say, for example, you ask yourself the question, what's the deep longing of my heart? Why did I become a practitioner? All these questions that are the same question. And the answer comes up, I want happiness. That's usually where we end. Okay, I want happiness. Again, the universal thing. It's a concept. Okay, good. Now, what do you mean by happiness? Sink below that. When you use a word, and usually when we ask ourselves these deep questions, we come up with very big words. Peace, enlightenment, happiness. What do you mean by that? What is happiness for you? What's your lived experience of that which you're calling happiness? I can almost guarantee you that it's not the same as other people in this room. My brother and I were separated when we were very young. We were orphaned when we were young, so different areas of our family took care of us. So after many years, he came to visit me in Deer Park. And I said, what do you want to do? And he said, well, what I most want to do is to take you to Universal Studios, which is like Disneyland. And I thought, God, no. So I thought I came up with a foolproof plan. And I said to him, okay, you need to write a letter to ask all of the brothers in our community, can you take me to Universal Studios? And I thought, no problem, I have nothing to worry about, because the brothers will say, no, it's inappropriate for a monastic to go to Universal Studios. Safe. So the brothers received this request, and they discussed it, and they said, you should really go, Brother Phai. Well, that was disappointing. So I went with my brother to Universal Studios, and it had been more than 2 decades since I went to a theme park. We don't normally go as monastics. And so I went on the roller coasters and things, and I didn't know that at the end of each of the roller coaster rides, there was like an automatic picture that was being taken. And when we got off the first of these rides, well, my brother got off and I stood against the wall a little. He went over to a kiosk and started scrolling through some digital photos on an iPad. And he explained to me that they take photos of the last moment on the ride. So he showed me the photo, and everybody else was, and I was. If you go to visit my brother and his wife, you'll see that on the wall of their living room, they have a selection of all of these photos of me, and then, yeah. One person's happiness is not always another person's happiness. So what do you mean by that? That which you're looking for. And would you recognize it? We're pretty confident that we would recognize if the Buddha walked in the room. Just after the Buddha was awakened, he went on alms round, and he was walking along very peacefully, and a young potter from the village saw the Buddha and said, so what's going on then? And the Buddha said, I'm a fully awakened one. And the potter looked him up and down and said, whatever, and then walked off. Many times, that which we're looking for is already there, but our idea can prevent us from touching it. So volition can be wholesome, it can be unwholesome, or it can be indeterminate. This deep longing of our heart is one of the main aspects of what we call volition. Another thing that I wanted to mention about volition is that it also goes along with something that we speak a lot of in Buddhism, which is craving. Actually, the word is tanha, which means thirst. And what do you think is the difference between craving and aspiration? That's something to reflect on. What's the difference? It can be, our aspiration can be wholesome, unwholesome, or indeterminate. But it goes together with this urge to become something, bhava, to become something other than what we are, where we are, to think we need one more thing. We think we need to get something in order to finally arrive at what we believe is our destination. That there's the beautiful metaphor in Buddhism of crossing over to the other shore. And that's one level of understanding. But also, on a deeper level, when we cross over to the other shore, we turn around and we realize that, in fact, there's been no journey that's been made. It's simply a shift of perspective. And it's not only a one-time event, but something that's happening over and over and over again. Our happiness and suffering depends very much on the kinds of volition, motivation that we're playing out. So finally, the most subtle of the nutriments is consciousness itself. And Sister Daungyim did a beautiful job the other day sharing about consciousness. So I feel I don't need to share very much about this at all. In our consciousness, there are 51 seeds. Seeds that are considered to be, usually we call them positive, seeds that are considered to be negative, and seeds that are indeterminate. In fact, in the Pali language, the word that is used, usually translated as positive, is kusala. It means skillful. And then the word that is usually translated as negative is akusala. It means not yet skillful. I love this translation. I love this. The original languages are really powerful because we see this from the very beginning. In Buddhist psychology, there's this non-opposition. There's this understanding that we have all of these seeds in our consciousness. No matter how much we want to deny it, we all have a seed of anger. And it's not something that should be or even can be gotten rid of. But what we can do is to bring the energy of mindfulness to that seed of anger, or sadness, or jealousy, or depression, and to transform that energy into wisdom. This transformation of the seeds in our consciousness are the very ground from which the wisdom and the insight that we're called to bring to the world come about. Not from the sky, but from deep within. We practice transformation, not transcendence. We often forget this powerful teaching in the Lotus Sutra, where the Buddha appears out of a stupa, and all of these bodhisattvas, these great beings, float down from the sky and say, we want to help you. We want to help you bring the teachings everywhere. And the Buddha says, I don't need your help. I don't want it. I have all the help that I need already. And suddenly the earth bursts open, and all these bodhisattvas come from the earth. In Buddhist psychology, particularly in the mind-only school, the Vijnanavada school to which we belong, the mind is seen to be a garden. From the earth of our lived experience, wisdom and transformation burst forth. The invitation of our time is not to become something or someone else or to float on the clouds 3 meters above the earth, but to allow that which is within us to spring forth, to transform that which is already there, to become a real human being. A couple of years ago, I was walking around New York City, and we don't really spend a lot of time in cities. And so I was walking around before we had an event, and out of nowhere, this man pointed to me and said, "Fake monk, fake monk, fake monk." And so I thought, what a good teaching, what a great opportunity to practice. I had no idea that there was the whole practice that some people have of dressing up like monks and selling wrist bracelets and things, like giving people a mala and asking for money. I had no idea. And yet I was reminded of our teacher's teaching many years ago that we should not sell fake goods in the marketplace. We shouldn't pretend to be peaceful, pretend to be happy, pretend to be whatever, but rather we need to be real. Let our peace, let our joy, let our understanding be something that is an embodied experience. So I thought that was a great invitation to ask myself, in what areas of my life am I real? Am I truly showing up? And in what areas of my life am I hiding? The challenge of our time is to be real. With all of the seeds in our consciousness, as we become aware of the functioning of the nutriments in our daily life, we start to know what we need to do and what we don't need to do in order to transform our situation. We call this selective watering. In the beginning of our practice, environment and being very conscious of our environment is essential. And as we progress, we begin to develop the capacity to be able to be in many different kinds of environment and not be too affected by it. But in the beginning, it's really important to choose and to become cognizant of the kinds of nutriments we're in contact with every day, and choose not to provide nutriment to those things that cause us or around us suffering. And those things which cause us suffering actually are those things which are not in alignment with what we most want. And actually it's quite challenging, because often those things that we know cause us suffering can be very sweet indeed. It's a lot like licking honey off a razor. It's sweet, but underneath there's something else there. Last time I was in Australia, I was in a corner store, and there were some mixed candies at the counter, and there were two young boys. They had a couple of dollars there, and they were discussing a lot, which candies will we get, which ones? And finally they came to their decision, and they pointed to the candies they wanted, and the woman behind the counter started to prepare them, and then one boy looked at the other and said, "We're gonna get sick." And so this is often our situation. Let's tell the truth. Do we have the courage to look at our situation and to choose the kind of nutriments that will bring forth those seeds in our consciousness that we most want to see? As we engage in selective watering, we begin to notice our habitual patterns of response. In other ways, the certain stories that we tell over and over again. When we think about samsara, this round of birth and death, this round of the round that we're trapped in, it's not something that's external to us, but it's something that's deep in our consciousness. I like to call these habitual patterns that I have tracks in the carpet. And the reason for that is that in my grandparents' house, it was always the 1970s. Even way into the 1990s, it never transitioned. And they had the shag pile carpet from the 70s that was there. And over the years, from repeated walking on that carpet, tracks formed. The track from the chair to the kitchen, and more particularly from the chair to the TV. There was a very well-worn path. All of us have these well-worn paths. A certain stimulus happens, a smell, a sound, a word, and then it comes up and there's a response. And usually it's a conditioned response, either from ourselves or from our ancestors, our culture, our genetic sensitivities. So by developing awareness of nutriment, we begin to become aware of this pattern of stimulus and response, and it empowers us to be able to recognize the ways in which suffering plays itself out over and over again. And so what I would like to finish with is asking you to ask yourself, what is my practice right here and right now? What is it that I need to look at? What is it that is the call of my heart? The thing sometimes that I don't want to look at, the things that I'm most afraid of. Understanding that there's a universal aspect to the path, and there's also something that's very unique as well. Not so long ago we went to the beach, and I had no hat, and I saw in a store next to the beach a very attractive sign. It said, "Cheap hats, one size fits all." So I said, great. And I got this hat. It was a couple of dollars. And maybe my head is strange, that's always a possibility, but it didn't fit me. It's the same in terms of the spiritual path. There's no one-size-fits-all roadmap of the spiritual path, so don't buy yours secondhand. How do you need to walk? How do you need to breathe? How do you need to eat in order to be able to transform your situation? Often this requires a deep letting go, and that can be scary. There are two kinds of letting go. The first is the one we're most familiar with, like that. The second kind of letting go is like this. I'm not grasping onto it, I haven't thrown it away, it's part of my experience and I'm looking into it, but I don't define myself by it. Sometimes letting go of what we think we need to become can be the greatest gift we can offer ourselves and offer others. The Buddha has given us a roadmap. And for us, we know all the landmarks on the journey. The invitation for us is to actually embark on the journey, to put one thing into practice. Here, we're told often that there are so many Dharma doors, so many practices, and we need to master them all. How on earth are we going to do that? We have problems even following our breathing, let alone mastering all of these different practices. More recently, I've felt that one of the qualities of practice is that in one practice, we can touch everything. In a simple practice such as mindful breathing, it will lead us onwards. We don't need to master 84,000 practices. We need to master one, and it will be enough to transform our heart. There are many doors of this meditation hall, and each of us chose the door that we wanted to come through, that was most convenient for us. And then now it doesn't really matter which door you came through, right? We're all sharing the same space. So in the same way, to go deeply into one practice is to go deeply into them all. So I invite you, as you transition home from Plum Village, to choose one thing. That one thing, simple practice such as stopping with the bell, of having some time for mindful breathing, mindful eating, can be enough to transform your life. So, have a wonderful day.